Tested across 6A games, the 7600X 3D delivers 94% of 7800X 3D performance for $100 less. We break down cost per frame and when the gap matters. We ran both processors on identical test beds, DDR5 6000, CL30, RTX 4070 Ti, 1 terabytes, Gen 4 NVMe. All games set to competitive settings. Medium textures, low shadows, effects off to maximize CPU load. Frame time percentiles captured with present MON over 5-minute gameplay segments. Warzone 3 or Zixstan, 7600X3D, 187 frames per second AVG. 7800X3D, 198 frames per second, plus 11 frames per second, 5.9% delta. It's 2. Ancient comp settings. 7600X3D, 412 frames per second, 7800X3D, 441 frames per second, 29 frames per second, 7.0% delta. Cyberpunk 2077 Dogtown, 7600X3D, 118 frames per second, 7800X3D, 121 frames per second, plus 3 frames per second, 2.5% delta. Starfield, New Atlantis, 7600X 3D, 87 frames per second, 7800X 3D, 96 frames per second, 9 frames per second, 10.3% delta. Baldur's Gate 3, Act 3 City, 7600X 3D, 104 frames per second, 7800X 3D, 108 frames per second, plus 4 frames per second, 3.8%. At $249 versus $349, you're paying $100 for an average 9 frames per second gain across our test suite. That's 11 per frame. For context, jumping from an RX 7700 XT, $389, to an RTX 4070, $549, nets you 18 to 22 frames per second in the same titles for $160 or $8 per frame. The GPU upgrade wins on value. In a 1000 footage build, that $100 is the difference between an RX 7800 XT and an RTX 4070. The 4070 delivers 15 to 20% more frames per second than the 7800 XT in ray-traced games, dwarfing the CPU delta. The 7600 X3D lets you reallocate budget where it moves the needle. Use our free playbook generator to model exact frames per second. 3 scenarios justify the $100 premium. First, you're building around a 4090 or 7900 XTX at 1080p for esports. Every frame counts when you're already north of 300 frames per second, and competitive advantage scales logarithmically. The 7800 X3D's extra cores also help with Discord, OBS, and browser tabs during streams without frames per second drops. Second, heavy productivity workloads alongside gaming. The 7800 X3D's 2 extra cores, 8-core versus 6-core, deliver 22 to 28% faster compile times in Unreal Engine and 18% faster Premiere Pro exports. If you're a dev or content creator who games, the 7800 X3D is a do-everything chip. The 7600 X3D is gaming first and productivity adequate. You're locking in a platform for 5+ years. The average frames per second tells half the story. We logged 1% and 0.1% lows across our test suite because stutters kill immersion more than a lower average. The 7600 X3D's V-cache kept frame time variance within 3% of the 7800 X3D in 5 out of 6 games. Only Starfield showed a 7% wider 0.1% gap during city NPC load-ins. Both chips maintain sub-8 milliseconds frame times in Warzone and CS2, which is the magic threshold for competitive input lag. Neither will be your bottleneck if you're pairing with a 240 Hz plus display. The 7600X3D's 96 megabytes L3 cache versus the 7800X3D's 96 megabytes means identical cache per core ratios, 16 megabytes per core on both. The latency advantage is identical. Where? Both CPUs run the same 5nm Zen 4 architecture with 3D V cache, so power draw is nearly identical. We measured 68 watts gaming average on the 7600X3D and 72 watts on the 7800X3D under sustained cyberpunk load. Peak package power hit 88 watts and 91 watts respectively. A quality tower cooler like the Thermalright Peerless Assassin handles both without breaking 72 degrees Celsius. Neither chip requires exotic cooling. A 35 air cooler or 240mm AIO is overkill, but gives you silent operation. The 7800X3D's extra cores don't translate to meaningfully higher heat because they're not maxed during gaming workloads. Both CPUs boost to the same 5.2 gigahertz depending on workload and Silicon Lottery. Enable Expo XMP4. The Ryzen 5 7600X3D is the smart buy for 85% of gamers building in 2024. You're getting 94% of the performance for 71% of the cost, and the frames per second delta disappears at 1440p or 4K, where your GPU does the heavy lifting. The money saved funds a better GPU or faster RAM, which delivers bigger real-world gains. The 7800X3D earns its keep if you're chasing 360 frames per second esports, streaming on the same rig, or running dev tools alongside gaming. It's also the pick if you're building once and riding it for 5 years. The extra cores buy insurance as game engines evolve. But if you're a 1440p gamer on a build your free playbook for any GPU at betterfps.com/optimize.